Hey, what is going on, everybody, and welcome to Fantasia. For today, we're going to be jumping into another session of Epic 7. Now, today, got another tier list for you guys. Yesterday, we posted the RGB 5-star Selector tier list for the upcoming event that's currently live, and I thought, you know what, might as well go ahead and cover the artifacts as well, because we have some artifact selector tickets too. So, let's go ahead and jump into this. Now, before we begin, on the left side are my categories here, kind of sort of the same as I did from the previous year, but the first category is the must-own category, things I think that are invaluable to any player. These not only are going to be for like PvP, but also some are like PvE. I tried to narrow it down as much as possible because I know we don't have that many selector tickets. Hopefully you already own like one or two of these, and or if you're a new player, hopefully you open the 5-star artifact tickets, the random ones, and you get some of these, right? And then hopefully you can use the selectors after you use those random tickets, just so you don't end up getting a ton of dupes. Although the dupes of these are pretty good anyway, so you keep them separated. Next up, we have the very strong category. These are artifacts that are going to be pretty useful across the board. Again, these are mostly like PvP artifacts. For PvE purposes, there really aren't too many things that you must have. There are a few, and I will touch on them. They do end up mostly in the niche category here, but we do include those and we take into consideration. The strong category are things that aren't as good as the must-own and the very strong. They're just pretty decent generic stuff that can be used as filler on units. They're just not as good as the one in the tier above it, obviously. Right, but we'll get into those when we touch on them. The next up is the niche category. These are artifacts that really don't see too much use across the board in like generic, but it can really benefit certain units and certain playstyles very well, right? So that goes here. It includes a ton of PvE artifacts too. So yeah, we'll touch on those again when we get there. The just don't is pretty self-explanatory. Pretty much don't choose these artifacts. They're not going to add much value to your rosters, to your units. They're artifacts that really just are kind of subpar, right? And some of them may end up be useful in things like PvE content, but overall, just not really worth it. The next three categories are other, limited, and collaboration. These are all going to be unavailable. I split them up just to kind of make sure that it's very clear. Collaboration stuff, not available here. Limited stuff, not available. And the other category, this includes like things you can buy from the Hall of Trials shop, the Guild Wars shop, things you earn from doing side stories. They're technically all free things, but you cannot get them with these selector tickets. Right? But anyway, let's go ahead and dive into things. First things first, we're going to go through all of the other limited and collaboration stuff just so you guys know what's not available, right? Again, these are the things that are not going to be available. So let's start. The first thing in the other category is going to be the otherworldly machinery. You can get that through a side story pretty easily. Next up is going to be a very strong artifact, actually. It's going to be Chatty. Chatty is really good. You can get a copy of it through the Spooky Solayu stories. This is a really strong artifact, but again, you can't get it here. Magic for Friends you can get from unlocking Meru's like kind of alternate form, like specialty change sort of, just by playing through the adventure. Sword of Cycling Seasons is for Aiden. You can again get that through playing through the adventure. Dark Bloodkeeper, not going to be available. Hey, Genoa's not available for pick in the 5-star RGB selector, so unfortunately his artifact is also unavailable for us here. Bird's Eye View is because Brigitta's unavailable to summon, and unfortunately Wukong is unavailable to summon, so his artifact is also not going to be there. Seal of Capture is a side story artifact from like the Knockwall kind of side story thing. It is actually a pretty good artifact, and Bihu can use it very well, but again, you can't get it here. Cruel Mischief is from the Hall of Trials, so is Sword of Ezra, and all the guild artifacts like Symbol of Unity, Proof of Valor, we have Bastion of Hope, they're all unavailable here. We also see on the guild ones here. There we go. Warhorn. I like lost my place there. We also have Victorious Flag. Again, all of these are really good artifacts. These 5 guild ones, you just can't get them through this. Guide to a Decision, also unavailable here. And then we go to the limited units. So Rangar's Special Drink for Seaside Bologna. We have Star of the Deep Sea for Summertime Assyria. Mature Sunglasses from Getting Summer Break. Charlotte's side story when that reruns. Prayer of Solitude from Lethe, right? Soul Consolation, again, a very strong artifact, but only for from the Ocean Breeze Luluka Lethe side story event. Spotted Mouse Hair Tie, we just had this event. I actually pretty sure Frida is still available to summon. Maybe I haven't checked, but I think Frida lasts until the end of the event, right? And that hasn't ended yet, but you still have a chance to get that if you really want it. And then moving on here, we have the Magic Bubble Maker. That's the Summer Ida artifact. Again, you can't get that just past, so unfortunately you have to wait a while to get that there. Champions Trophy is another one that's unavailable currently from one of the previous event side stories. Draco Play, I think, was from Luna's side story. Wall of Order was from Landy's. Fairy Tale for Nightmares from Fairy Tale Tenebria's. Guiding Light is from Celine. And yeah, that's quite a bit of unavailable artifacts right here, right? But wait, there's more. So, Unfading Memories from DN's side story, Fan of Light and Dark from Ahmed's, Hostess of the Banquet from Midnight God Lilius. We have Old Gardening Shears from Bibulus, Seductive Flower from Blooming Litica, and unfortunately, guys, because Laya's not available, Sweet Miracle, one of the best artifacts in the game right now, is also unavailable. So yeah, these are all the limited artifacts, quite a bit that you can't get. Again, I'm just showing you guys these, getting them out of the way so you guys know what to expect when you're opening these books. All right, next up we have the collaboration stuff. Again, stuff that's available through these collaboration side stories or from summoning on these banners, and you can't get them through these. Junkyard Dog from Soul. We have Necronundine from Dizzy. Torn Sleeve from Biken. We have Miss Confiel from Elfelt. We have Jacko's Symbol for Jacko, obviously. And then we have the ReZero artifacts. So Rom's artifact, Rem's artifact, and Amelia's artifact. We have Rimaru's artifact, Milim's artifact. We have Shuna's artifact, and Benimaru's. Next up, we have all of the Aspa collabs, so POS. We have all of the 4, I'm not going to go through all of them, all the 4 girls here, and also Rocket Punch Gauntlet. So if you missed out on that collab, you really, well, one, you don't really need this because you don't have Karina, because Karina is the best use of this artifact. It's still really good on several nights. Just unfortunate that we don't have anything similar to that in the regular pool. Next up, we have Ed's artifact, Roy's, and Riza's from the Full Metal Alchemist collaboration. And then we have Ain's, Shaltir, and Albedo's. So Albedo's artifact is super, super strong. But again, unfortunately, we don't have anything equivalent to that right now in the non-limited pool. Okay, so with this out of the way, these are all the things that you cannot get. Now let's talk about the things that you can. So starting off with the must-own category, only have 4 things here. Number 1 is Elbrus Ritual Sword. If you fought Abyssal Fiends, Navy Captain Landes, if you guys are new to the game, hey, Elbrus Ritual Sword basically allows you to counterattack when any of your allies are hit, right? There's a chance to counterattack. So this thing is a very, very explosive artifact, and when it pops off and the RNG's in your favor, you're really decimating your opponents here. All right, next up we have Sigurd Scythe. Withstood the test of time here, guys. Sigurd Scythe is a healing artifact. Once you get below 50% health on a warrior, you get to get increased attack, and you take some of the damage that you dealt and you recover it as HP. So you get a kind of lifesteal effect there. Really good for self-sustaining and can be used on a plethora of warrior units. Now, if your warrior doesn't scale with attack, Golden Rose is now available. This is one of the things that was not available last year during the 5-star artifact selectors, and it's Abigail's artifact, but you can use it on so many different warriors, things like Shu, Alencia, you can use it on Ed, right? You have so many different units that can benefit from this. If they're not attack scaling, you're probably using Golden Rose, or if you have AoE type hits, right, like Shu and Alencia and stuff, you can also use this artifact. Because Sigurd Scythe, the attack scaling is okay for those types of units, but it's still not as ideal, right, as something like Golden Rose, which also increases your damage, by the way. Next up, we have Song of Stars. So Song of Stars is a PvE-oriented artifact in most cases. There are some niche cases in PvP, such as Lua using it to counter her counters, like Fire Lilius, but that out of the way, Song of the Stars is really, really strong. If you're starting out, I'd recommend picking up one of these, honestly. It goes really well with Assyria, who was one of my must-own units in the RGB 5-star selector. So you take Song of the Stars, put it on Assyria. Now Assyria can both defense break and put a target debuff. Target debuff allows you to increase the damage that you're dealing to that person with the target debuff by 15%. So it is quite strong. Right? Really useful in PvE content all throughout. Like, even when you reach endgame, you're still going to be using this. All right, next up we have Bastion of Perlucia for the very strong category. Bastion is an artifact that got buffed, and oh boy, is it good, right? Barrier and immunity for the front line and the very back line unit. It's really nice for knights to help protect units. Also helps prevent your units from getting their buffs stripped. You can run this on Christie. You can run this on so many different knights, right? Ambitious Tywin is another one that really uses this quite well, and he's very meta right now too. So yeah, Bastion, definitely a very strong artifact. Next up, we have some evasion shenanigans with Shepherd of the Hollow. Probably one of the best evasion artifacts out there. Savior Aiden, who's a very strong free character, can definitely utilize this. It is, in most cases, I think, more applicable than her own artifact, which isn't bad, but this one's just a bit more generic. Increases damage dealt as you get lower in HP, and multiple different thieves can use this, including things like Remnant Violet, for example. Alright, next up we have Wind Rider. This is an artifact that saw resurgence in use, especially when Genoa came out. Genoa can use this, Spirit Iceling can use this. I know Genoa's not up for the selectors, but hey, maybe you're like, I don't have Wind Rider, I have Genoa. I've been playing for a little bit, but not too long. Don't have a bunch of these artifacts. Wind Rider's a pretty good pickup. It's good on other thieves as well. Spirit Iceling, for example, I think I mentioned. It used to be good on things like Kisei and such, but yeah, Wind Rider, pretty fantastic stuff, because it allows you to stealth after you kill somebody, so it protects your thieves. Alright, next up we have Abyssal Crown. This is a really strong debuffing artifact that has a chance to stun. Doesn't have the limitations on it, so you can still stun on extra attack, counter attacks, AoE attacks. It is really good. You have the ability to potentially luck sack your opponents and just stun their entire team for free. Artifacts also don't care if you miss on your target. So let's say you're attacking an evasion unit or a unit you have elemental disadvantage against. When you attack them and you miss, normally you wouldn't be able to apply any debuffs or negative effects, right? But Abyssal Crown's a little different. Artifacts are different. You can still apply those debuffs because artifacts work just differently, I guess, in the game. So Abyssal Crown can still stun on miss. Really good stuff. RNL, you might see the meme of Ron never loses. That's because if you use Ron and you put RNL on him, he has chances to take extra turns for no reason. So RNL allows the thief, anytime they take a turn, they have a percent chance, a pretty high percent chance, to take an extra turn. I believe it's like 30 or 40%. So yeah, really, really strong Luxaki artifact. Been used on various different units on DPSs and openers. I've seen Genoa's with RNL before too. It's kind of disgusting. So yeah, take it as you will, but RNL, really, really solid. Next up, we have the Rod of Amaryllis here. Now, Rod of Amaryllis is oh, sorry, it should be in the strong category. Rod of Amaryllis is a healing artifact that allows anytime your Soul Weaver uses a non-attack skill, heals the lowest HP ally on your team by a pretty decent chunk, right? So it's a pretty solid healing artifact, especially for early game. It'll carry you through late game. There's still certain Soul Weavers that can use it. Next up, we have Celestine. This thing has been seeing a resurgence of use with Blood Moon Haste. So if you have Blood Moon Haste, Celestine is probably one of the best artifacts in the game for him. It is a very, very solid one that provides so much healing for any time your Soul Weaver does an attack. Right? It doesn't have to be an S1, it could be an extra attack, all that stuff. You get some extra healing. It is really good. Next up, Doctor's Bag, another Soul Weaver artifact, pretty strong, used on quite a few units actually. Bunny Dom being a very popular one that people put this on. It provides some healing, provides some cleansing, and overall it is pretty nice to supplement units, especially ones that don't have very strong cleansing or healing capabilities in their kit. Again, for example, like Bunny Dom, it's a pretty solid option. Next up, speaking of healing, we have Bloodstone. This is a ranger artifact, and honestly, I'm kind of torn on this, right? I kind of want to put it up to like a must-own here, but I'm putting it in the strong category, right? Just because it's not super applicable across like PvP content. It is pretty good in PvE, and it allows your units to heal up without a Soul Weaver. So it turns your damage dealers like Landy, like Bellona, right, into healers for the entire team. Heals the lowest HP ally by a percentage of the damage that you deal. So against PvE units, against PvE mobs and stuff, you deal quite a bit of damage. You can pretty much cap out your entire team with health. And it's useful in things like expeditions and things like that as well, right? Nightmare Labyrinth and all that good stuff. All right, next up we have Alexa's Basket. I put this in a strong category because while it is really good, it has the chance to get the attack buff. You have a greater attack buff that you can get. It's still not super applicable to a ton of units. Alexa's Basket right now is used a lot on things like Arbor Vildred. You sometimes see it on other thieves, but things like Shepherd of the Hollow I put up here because it's really good for evasion type units, and most thieves without evasion are pretty much not in the meta currently, right? Or some other way to stay alive. Genoa, for example, but Genoa has things like Wind Rider. In Alexa's Baskets, it's okay, but it's kind of more subpar. You're pretty much trying to luck sack with the greater attack buff because Genoa self-attack buffs, right? A lot of units nowadays self-attack buff, or you have really good attack buffers on your team already, so this is not really required. Next up, we have Merciless Glutton. Really good warrior artifact if you're doing a more aggro type of team and you're trying to cleave. This is pretty good for using something like on something like Jacko. You can, once you kill somebody, you push up your team's combat readiness, right? It's not terrible. So it's a pretty good artifact for that like tempo type of teams. But if you're not playing super aggressively, then it's not that great, right? Next up is Broken Will of the Priest. It's a knight artifact and allows your knights to penetrate defense. This also works on AoE attacks, so you can use it on things like Fire Charlotte, for example. It's a pretty solid artifact. I know most knights probably just want to use Elber's Ritual Sword, but that's why it's down here in the strong category. It's not like really required, but it is pretty good for what it does. You really rarely get artifacts that allow you to penetrate defense, especially on things like AoE attacks, right? Even penetration set, the gear set, only allows you to do it on single target attacks. All right, next up we have Double-Edged Decrescent. Very good artifact actually, because it allows your unit to get extra evasion, 20%, just like Shepherd of the Hollow. But Shepherd of the Hollow increases damage the lower your HP goes. You can use it on things like BBK, for example, if you really want. Double-Edged Decrescent gives you a chance to counterattack. It's like having a counter set on your thief. Okay, so it is still really strong. I don't think it's as applicable as something like Shepherd of the Hollow, because you don't always have units that would want the evasion and the ability to counter. But yeah, Double-Edged Crescent still not terrible here. A good choice. The evasion that you get is just flat, like 20%, and then what you get from upgrading it is your percent chance to counter. But yeah, not too bad, right? Kind of like again, counter artifacts are still good in general, kind of like why Elbrus is really good. So that's why this is here. Next up, we have Secret Art Storm Sword. I put this in the strong category, even though really only Selene uses this artifact. But Selene is so good right now that pretty much makes this artifact amazing. It is also useful in other characters. You can use it on things like Spirit Eye Selene, or if you have some thieves that want to cut your opponents, right? People have used this before in the past on things like Tempest Surin, really fast builds with Tempest Surin to annihilate their opponents early on by cutting the opponent's openers. It's not terrible. When your opponent uses a non-attack skill, you push up your combat readiness, right? So this allows you to kind of implement some shenanigans. All right, next up we have Holy Sacrifice. I know I'm putting this in a strong category, but there's an asterisk around this, right? Holy Sacrifice is very strong. You see it on things like Abyssal Fiend, Empyrean Ilonov. You see it in a lot of PvP units. Holy Sacrifice is only good though if you have it max limit broken. So if you don't have a copy, Probably wouldn't recommend you go out of your way to get Holy Sacrifice, because at plus 15, you only have a 75% chance to revive after you die, right? And that's just not good. You really want that 100% chance, right? You don't want your unit to die and you're like, all right, Holy Sacrifice, we got this. And then your unit just never shows back up. It's very sad. But there's only Max Limit Broken. Like, if you're one away from getting it Max Limit Broken, you can consider it. But even then, there's a lot of stuff I'd probably rather get duplicates of before I max out a Holy Sacrifice, right? Things like Elbrus Ritual Sword, Sigurd's Scythe, Golden Rose, I definitely want multiple copies of that are not kind of imprinted, right? Not combined. Song of the Stars, you definitely want to combine, trying to max that out. All right, next up, we have the niche category. So these are a lot of the artifacts that I think are good on a few select units. I know, again, Celine was like the only one that can really use Secret Art Storm Sword, but because she's so strong, it's up there. Snow Crystal. So starting with the Snow Crystal here, you can use this on things like Shu, for example. I've seen this used on other things like Assassin Cartuja, General Purgus. You can use it on a bunch of units that you'd really just want to see some CR pushing on for the Warriors. Helps turn cycling quite a bit. Yeah, so I definitely recommend this. It's a pretty decent artifact overall for Warriors. Next up for CR pushing, tempo artifacts are not bad, right? So Durandal, I think since the last time we did one of these lists, Durandal has gotten a buff. It's much better now. You don't need an HP threshold in order to get your CR push. Anytime you're hit now, you get some CR push, and when you're below a certain threshold, you get extra combat readiness pushes, right? So Durandal is actually really good for turn cycling. I personally use it on Lionheart Sirmia. I think you can get away with it on multiple different types of units. General Purgus, for example, can also probably use this. Dark Corvus, for example. Yeah, there's quite a few units out there that can definitely take advantage of something like that. Next up, we have Spear of a New Dawn, pretty much only used on Senya. Some people use it on other knights. People have tried to use like Abyssal Yufine or Navy Captain Landy with stuff like this. It's a little weird, but hey, to each their own. Spear of a New Dawn just allows you to do extra damage whenever you attack your opponent. So Senya just pokes at the opponent and you deal extra damage that scales with her attack stat. So overall, it's not bad. On the similar note, we have Uberius' Tooth, which is a warrior artifact, as opposed to Spear, which is a knight artifact. And Uberius' Tooth also does the same thing. You do extra damage, like kind of chip damage, based on your attack stat, right? It just scales with your attack. So the more your attack, the more damage you're doing. It's pretty decent as an artifact. So yeah, I personally, you can use it on things like Arunka, you can use it on things like Hua Young. Even though those two units aren't really super meta right now, it's still useful sometimes in things like Guild Wars, especially against units that have passives and stuff that prevent them from falling below a certain HP threshold. For example, Midnight Gala Lilius can't take more than 35% of her max damage or max health as damage. But if you hit them and you hit that threshold, right, Uberius' Tooth procs afterwards, Spear of a New Dawn as well, and you can chunk them down quite a bit. Okay, it's very similar to how 3F works, actually. So 3F and Rocket Punch Gauntlet, which are both, by the way, unavailable collaboration artifacts. Yeah, the Spear of a New Dawn and like Uberius' Tooth are the only things that really come close to what they do. But these scale with attack, Rocket Punch scales with defense, and 3F scales with HP. Okay, next up we have Indestructible Gators. So this is also a pretty decent artifact. It does allow you to inflict like extra burns and stuff, and gets you some combat readiness, but really only Infernal Kawazu really would use something like this. There might be a few other units out there that I'm missing, but Infernal Kawazu is pretty good on him. Spear of Purification also pretty good on Infernal Kawazu. Kawazu is a very niche unit in PvP. You don't really see him all too much right now, but he really excels when your opponent's using a bunch of AoE openers and there's a really tanky unit on the other side that he can potentially one-shot with burns. Right? Spear of Purification is a good artifact for units to cut your opponent, actually. I've seen this used on various types of units, actually. So yeah, anytime your opponent uses a non-attack skill, you push up in combat readiness, and it's quite nice. You can use this to cut your opponent's openers and then go after their units and then kind of finish off their squishier units with this. Okay, Samsara Prayer Beads. This is actually a decent artifact for damage. Obviously not as good as some of the stuff up here. Like, you really want Sigurd and Golden Rose. But Samsara Prayer Beads increases your single target hit damage, but also decreases the single target damage that you take. It can be used on certain units. I don't really see it all too often. It's kind of more of like a backup damage artifact. Like, you ran out of artifacts for your warriors. You slap one of these on them. No unit in particular prefers this over other things. Right, next up, Sacred Tree Branch. This artifact's actually really good on Sharoon and Dragon King Sharoon. Dragon King Sharoon is pretty meta, so she is a unit that really benefits from this artifact. Anytime you use an attack skill, pushes up the combat readiness of your highest attack unit by a certain amount. So yeah, Sacred Tree Branch, pretty good. Next up, we have Stella Harpa. Honestly, in the niche category, but if it's like PvE specifically, you can probably bump this up to strong or very strong, because every time the Soul Weaver is hit, right, you have a chance to cleanse a debuff on your team. So usually you use this against PvE monsters that really spam like a bunch of attacks on you and spam debuffs on you. So for example, in Nightmare Labyrinth, if you're fighting Drewleaf Council, it will put a bunch of Venoms on your team, which suck. They hurt quite a bit and they decrease your max health. But if you have a Rowana in the front line, Rowana, by the way, being one of the must-have 5-star RGB units in my Selector tier list, Rowana carrying Stella Harpa can help you a ton with Rowana's passive keeping you alive, but Rowana doesn't have any inner cleansing, but every time she's hit, if you put her in the front line, Stella Harpa has a chance to cleanse your team, which gives you a really nice bonus, right? So it's a pretty solid artifact overall. Don't really see too much use in PvP. It used to see some use, but not anymore. It is a little too RNG based for the current like meta, where you get a ton of debuffs on your team. I think if this will switch to something like 100%, it might be busted, but consistency is key if you want to see it in PvP. Right, so there's that. Next up, we have Touch of Rekos. Touch of Rekos is a really good artifact for healing. Some people use it on very fast Soul Weavers when they turn cycle, right? Anytime that Soul Weaver is hit once per turn, you can heal the team by a set amount based on your HP stat. So it's a pretty solid artifact overall. Good for, again, maintaining heals on your team. It's a little bit more subpar because you have to kind of bank on your opponent hitting your Soul Weaver, as opposed to, you know, Rod of Amaryllis, where you can control when you use your non-attack skill. Same with Doctor's Bag, you control when you use your non-attack skill. Or Celestine, where you can control when you attack, right? Celestine also has the benefit of being able to proc on counters as well. So when you're able to counter with Celestine, you get extra healing bonuses there. So Touch of Rekos is kind of just an inferior version, but again, used in some PvE content like Ancient Inheritance and stuff. So it doesn't have like completely zero use. All right, next up is Idol's Cheer. Idol's Cheer is a little niche. It is used in PvE content quite a bit. You usually use it with stuff like Rowana, for example, if you're doing the Ice Expedition. You can also use Idol's Cheer on PvP units. Sometimes I see some Blood Moon Haste use Idol's Cheer to push up units. The main reason why it's on Blood Moon Haste is because if you kill Blood Moon Haste's teammates, then he gets his buff. He can one-shot somebody on your team and revive everyone on his team. So you're going to want to focus Blood Moon Haste first. But while you're focusing Blood Moon Haste, if he has Idol's Cheer, the good thing with Idol's Cheer is that, it pushes up that damage dealer, and that damage dealer will end up killing your team. So it is a double-edged sword for your opponent, right? Who do you attack first? Do you attack the Haste teammate, or do you attack Haste? Either way, they're probably in for big hurting. Next up, we have Shamadra Staff. It's a really good artifact. It provides flat 20% effect resistance to everyone on your team. It is really good for that, and it increases healing amount that is received by all of your allies by a set amount, depending on how much you enhance it. But Shamadra Staff, it works with both Soul Weaver, like non-attack skill healing. It also works with Lifesteal, also works with artifacts like Sigurd and Golden Rose. You can get some really cool shenanigans going with healing team comps, right? Self-healers and stuff with this artifact. It's actually quite cool. Next up, we have Spirit's Breath. Spirit's Breath is mostly a PvE artifact now. It's used to reset your non-attack skill every time you use it. If it's max limit broken, it's 100%. But even if you don't have it max limit broken, it's still kind of nice to have, because it does allow you to kind of cheese a lot of content. Sometimes if you get lucky, you can use this in Abyss stages, you can use this in expeditions, you can use this in Hall of Trials, for example, is where people put it on auxiliary lots, a 4-star ML, well, and you can reset as S2, which allows them to constantly push up the combat readiness of your DPS unit, so you can burst down the boss. Next up, a spatiotemporal fan. It's a niche because not many units can use it, but it is very impactful, very good artifact. When you use a non-attack skill on a ranger, it will stealth the highest attack unit on your team, basically hiding them from your opponent. So if your opponent's only bringing single target units and you have a really fast ranger that opens up for your team that does a non-attack skill, well, congratulations, you've just stealthed your biggest threat to your opponent and they can't do anything about it. So yeah, very strong, but again, quite niche with who can use it. It's like Lua's artifact. Lua can use it, right? You can also probably use an Emma Politis, for example. I've seen that there too. Next up, we have Unseen Observer. This is Flan's artifact, but when you use a non-attack skill, you gain 10 souls, or more, depending on how much they are. Oh no, I think, no, never mind. You get 10 souls, and then you gain combat readiness based on how much this is enhanced. So even at plus 15, it's pretty good. I use it on Emma Politis. You can also use this on Lua. You can use this on Flan. You can use it on a lot of rangers that have non-attack skills. It's nice because the soul burn's allowed to keep cascading your units that come afterwards, and you can end up dealing quite a bit of damage to your opponent or ignoring resistance, right? Doing your soul burn effects, whatever it is that you're after. All right, so the niche category, man, it's going to be a big one because we also have Alabastron. So Alabastron here is a thief artifact. It increases your effectiveness by, I think, like 35% or something. It's actually really good. And then it adds the ability, every time you attack, it adds a chance to inflict an extra debuff. And the debuffs are actually quite nice as well. The reason it's in the niche category is because it's really good in PvE. Sometimes it's good in PvP. Like the last unit that was really good with it was I Winter. Again, a limited unit, right? So you can't get that with the Selector books or anything. She's kind of fallen from grace in the meta. She was used to counter Destina back in the day, but Alabastron's still really solid, and you can definitely use it on quite a few units in PvE right now. And eventually, you know, when the time comes, there might be a unit that can use it in PvP as well. All right. Next up, we have Sword of Summer Twilight. Sword of Summer Twilight is a pretty decent one. Again, it's a defense penetration artifact, which is kind of nice. Much like how Broken Will the Priest allows your knights to penetrate defense, even on AoEs. Sword of Summer Twilight does the same thing. It allows you to penetrate defense, even on AoEs with thieves. Okay, so it's a pretty good one. And I believe if you kill, it allows you to push up your entire team as well. So it's not bad. But again, there's not too many units who can utilize this very well. Earth Vildred, this is his own artifact, is really good on this artifact, but there hasn't really been too many other units that can take advantage of it fully. That's why it's in a niche category. Goblet of Oath gives you effectiveness on your thief, and it allows you to, when you use a non-attack skill, decrease the cooldowns of all your skills by 1 turn. Usually used on Peyra, it's her artifact after all, but you can actually use it to cheese some things with some fun team comps. I've seen this on units like Penelope before, but again, because it's kind of weird on a thief, you need non-attack skills, right? So it's more of on a support thief than a damage thief. You don't really see this being used all too often because it does require non-attack skills, right? So yeah, and typically, again, there's better options. You can opt to go for things like RNL for extra turns, right? Which are pretty devastating. Okay, so next up we have Beguiling Wings. This is a decent artifact. I think it's Elvira's artifact here. It gives you a flat, like, 15, something like that, effect resistance, and then it's okay. It's not the best because there is Hostess of the Banquet, which gives like 30% resistance, right, at plus 15, which is pretty good. Now, Hostess of the Banquet is quite nice. It also increases damage that you deal, but Beguiling Wings, yeah, it's just kind of like a slightly inferior version. You can use it on things like Elvira, but aside from that, no one really wants to use this. But it is niche because it does have its place sometimes. Elegiac Candle? I can never pronounce this, this artifact name. But this is Knockwell's artifact. It allows you to defense break anytime you hit the opponents. It's a really low chance. I think at plus 15, it's like a 37.5%. I think at plus 30, it's a 50%. The good thing about it is you can AoE. So if you do an AoE attack, you have that chance, like 37.5% chance to defense break on every single unit that's out there. So you apply that check 4 times, right? So chance of you getting a defense break when you AoE is pretty high. It's not bad. I've seen some people use it on Knockwell. seen some people use it on Flitica, for example, but yeah, overall, it's okay. It's just not... It's not the best thing ever out there, especially because Guiding Light exists, but Guiding Light is a limited artifact, so do keep that in mind. All right, next up, we have Air-to-Surface Missile Misha. This is a damage artifact, increases crit damage of your rangers, and it allows you to have increased hit chance against evasion units. Kinda niche, honestly. It used to be that some Bryserias would use this, but now that Bryceria has an EE, Bryceria is much faster now. A lot of people are just opting to go for super fast Briar Witches that are on Guiding Light, right? So yeah, this can be used though in other forms of content. Like it's a good damage dealing artifact for rangers in like PvE content too. Rangers don't really have too many artifacts that just boost their damage output. They have a lot of gimmicky artifacts that are out there. So this is one that's pretty consistent for the class. Next up, we have Rise of a Monarch. This one is not terrible. It's kind of like FCC's passive, right? But in an artifact, rest in peace FCC. But anytime your knight takes a turn, after their turn ends, they give a barrier as a percentage of their own health to the ally with the lowest HP on the team. So Rise of a Monarch, pretty good for protecting people, especially units in stealth. Next up, Ancient Dragon's Legacy. This one is used on Fire Lilius, typically to counter things like Lua. You can also use it on Mort himself. This is his artifact after all. But if you use a non-attack skill on your knight user that's holding this, once per game, once per match, you get to decrease the cooldown duration of your units by 1 turn. So when Lua increases your cooldowns by a turn, you can decrease it by a turn and then kind of reset her whole reset on your team, if that makes sense, right? But the thing is, Lua can also use Song of the Stars to counter your Fire Lilius. It's kind of a little meta game between the two. Lua, thankfully, is not really prominent currently in the meta. She's still very strong, but not a very common pick. So Ancient Dragon Legacy kind of fell in usage a little bit. There are quite a few knights that can utilize this, though. So yeah, it's not bad to have. Next up, Circus Fantasia, one of the best gear score like kind of artifacts in the entire game. This gives you so much stats. It gives you effectiveness, right? It gives you, I believe, some crit chance as well. And yeah, it is just quite insane. This is typically only used on Judge Kisei though. We'll see with the buff patch that came out if Judge Kisei is really still is still able to use this, right? It seems like she probably won't really need it, but we'll see. Circus Fantasia, again, pretty solid overall. Can use this in PvE as well, just to raise your raise the effectiveness of some of your warrior units, and then give them some extra crit chance, right? Really decreases the quality of gear that you need in order to accomplish stuff, because this makes up for so much of it. All right, next up, a Little Queen's Huge Crown. Good for expeditions and things. Basically, you deal extra damage, and on top of that, if your opponent has a barrier, you deal additional extra damage, right? It'll just amplify your skills and how hard they hit. It's pretty decent in the light expedition, and that's really all I use it in. You can use this on things like Arunka, for example. It's pretty good on her. She already does extra damage against barrier units, and so this is not bad. All right, next up we have Alencinox's Wrath. This is Alencia's artifact. It actually just gives you a bunch of crit chance, right? It's not terrible, and then for extra attacks, I think you get some other bonus from it. I don't remember the specifics, but it is a pretty niche artifact. Really, it's only benefiting like 2 or 3 units out there, and most of them have better options, because again, with warrior artifacts, why would you go for Alencinox's Wrath when you can just go Sigurd's Scythe or Golden Rose, right? Yeah, it's really tough competition out there, so that's why it's down here. It's a niche artifact. Next up, Etika Scepter. It's actually pretty good. I'd argue you could probably put it in strong, but because the strong artifacts are a bit more generic in their use, Etika Scepter is okay. I use it on Carrot personally. It allows you to, every time you take a turn, you have a 50% chance to decrease your cooldowns by a turn. It allows you to turn cycle faster, but the thing is, it's a mage artifact, and most mages don't want Etika Scepter. Most mages just want Tagahel's Ancient Book, because why I have Etika Scepter, I have a chance to decrease your cooldown durations by a turn, when you can start the battle with 20 souls and soul burn into your opponent for ignore resistance effects, taking extra turns anyway, right? There's so many different things you do with soul burns, so that's why Etika Scepter is down here. Mage artifacts have a lot of competition. It's kind of why when you look up here in the Muststone and very strong, really only Abyssal Crown stands out, right? Even if you include the strong category, there's pretty much no mage artifact there, because why would you use anything else other than book? Alright, speaking of mage artifacts, Scroll of Shadows. This is Arya's artifact. Good for Arya. That's about it. So, yeah, if you have Arya, use this, especially if you don't have Fairy Tale for a Nightmare. I prefer Fairy Tale for a Nightmare. A lot of players do, because that extra damage is actually quite nice. It doesn't have to scale with her. It's just a flat fixed damage that you'll do on extra attacks. It's not something that scales with your actual damage output. Scroll of Shadows scales with your damage output, but it also has a chance to inflict extra debuffs on your opponent, which is quite nice. Alright, moving on, we have Blackhand the Goddess. Gives a lot of crit chance, but that crit chance will diminish every time your mage attacks. Again, it's not bad. It's actually really good for decreasing the crit rate threshold of your units, so you can build very fast, let's say for example top model Luluka's 300 plus speed, right? You can make her insane because you don't need all those rolls into crit chance. Blackhand the Goddess will help you out there. But aside from those niche scenarios where you want a really fast damage dealing mage, it's usually better off to just run book, right? When your gear is good enough, most people just end up running things like book because it's so much better. Alright, next up, Time Matter. Again, another mage artifact. This is a damage dealing mage artifact. If you kill while you have this artifact, it decreases your skill cooldowns by a turn. Really good on Vivian sometimes, for example. Can be used in Banshee runs, but other than that, you can kind of use it in PvE. If you just need a damage boost somewhere on your mages, it can come in handy. It's not a terrible artifact, but again, it's in the niche category, because why would you use this when you have book? Violet Talisman, it's in the niche category here. It's really rare to see an evasion artifact here because Double-Edged Decrescent is arguably better, and Shepherd of the Hollow is better too. But Violet Talisman, basically every time you take a turn, it increases your chance to evade up to 3 times. Technically, you can stack more evasion with this than you can with Double-Edged Decrescent and Shepherd of the Hollow, but because you have to take turns and turn cycle with it, you basically have to get lucky. You have to get luckier on your first 3 turns to make sure that you potentially have the chance to get luckier later on, right? So you have to get lucky early to get luckier later. It's kind of a coin toss, and evasion's already very iffy. So yeah, that's why it's down here. It's not in the don't category because it's not a terrible artifact. Remnant Violet can definitely use this, for example, but it is kind of a risk. You have to protect him quite well for you to get all 3 stacks. Alright, next up, last but not least, we have Bloody Rose. It's in the niche category this time around. I think it was in niche last time, maybe it was in Just Don't, but the reason I'm putting this here is because it actually has pretty good usage in PvE content for putting vampirism debuffs on the bosses, and you can use it to heal up your units, right? Ancient Inheritance was a great place to use the Bloody Rose. Sometimes it can be used in other forms of content too, but like other PvE content, but that's the main thing that I found use for. If you have a copy of it, great. If you have multiple copies of it, I'm so sorry for you. But I mean, this is coming from the person who has like 9 copies of it, unfortunately. But yeah, 1's good enough. But again, it's very niche. You don't really need to use your selector ticket for this, right? A lot of these things here you don't really need to use a selector ticket for unless you really know what you're doing. Otherwise, just stick to the stuff up top. Alright, next up, in the Just Don't category, we have Last Tea Time. Last Tea Time is, again, it's a mage damage dealing artifact. Basically, if you do AoEs, you do extra damage, and every time, I think if you take a turn, oh no, every time you use an AoE, you have like a small chance to like decrease your cooldowns by a turn. It's not terrible on things that AoE a lot, like Ball and Sazan or Tenebria, but overall, it's you don't need it. There are other things that you can use, for example, like Etika Scepter, right? Every time you take a turn, 50% chance to decrease your cooldown by a turn, rather than Last Tea Time where you have to use an AoE, and then there's, I think, up to like a 20-something% chance, I don't remember, to decrease by 1 turn. But yeah, anyway, probably not worth spending your selector on. Cradle of Life is also here. Now, this could technically be a niche, right? I could technically put it up here. I'm putting it in don't because it's useful, but only in PvE and only really in like Ancient Inheritance and stuff as well. I mean, I guess you can argue for Bloody Rose, but at least Bloody Rose's debuffs are nice and it has Vampirism for you. Cradle of Life is for warriors, and again, warriors have so much competition, right? Bloody Rose is for thieves. Thieves don't have too much support artifacts, so this is a nice one, but Cradle of Life, you can just put way better stuff on your warrior, right? Pretty decent Ancient Inheritance, but not really worth it to use a Selector ticket on. An offer you can't refuse, not bad for Eligos himself, not really great in other places. Just don't really bother. Border Coin, also pretty subpar artifact. You get attack and speed for using non-attack skills, but again, why stack your attack and speed when you can just kill your opponent with warrior artifacts that increase damage outright, or if you're tanking down and like kind of playing bruisers, Sigurd's Scythe and Golden Rose to help self-sustain your team. So yeah, it's just not that great. Crimson Moon of Nightmares is Tenebria's artifact. It relies on dual attacks to do its thing. Like you get the effect when your character attacks when it's not their turn. So therefore, it's not great. You're just relying on luck for that. And again, it's a mage artifact, so just use book. Creation and Destruction is a warrior artifact. There's a very, very low chance to reset the cooldowns of your skills after you use it. So technically, you can luck sack people with it. For example, people have done like Dark Corvus with it. You Dark Corvus S3, Creation and Destruction procs. On the next turn, you S3 again. It's pretty cool, but it's very, very gimmicky. Don't bother. You also would probably prefer it to be plus 30, so getting a single copy is probably not going to be very worthwhile. Crown of Glory decreases the damage that your team takes from AoE attacks, also takes 5 souls from the opponent, so you're kind of using this into like cleave teams. The issue with it is that your opponents can still just kind of destroy you. So their opener is probably going to be soul burning, and if they do that, you're just eating a bunch of damage anyway, and they've already used their souls. You're taking away nothing from them in most cases. Sometimes it can screw over your opponent, sometimes. I've seen this on arena defense teams, right? Sometimes too. It's pretty decent on things like A Tywin sometimes, Green Armin I've seen it on, but in most cases, people would just opt for a damage mitigation artifact like Aureus or Adamant Shield, so kind of good to pass on. Dignus Orb, you get a barrier if you use a non-attack skill that scales with your attack. Doesn't really matter though. It was used on Tomoka, but now Tomoka has her own pretty decent kit. It's been kind of reworked a little bit, so don't even bother. Dux Noctis, not great. It stacks extra attack every time your ally attacks, like hits an enemy. So you can stack it up several times. I forget, like 10 times or something. It's just not worth it because if you're cleaving with something like this is Pavel's artifact, by the way. If you're trying to cleave, there's better options for just pure damage, right? And if you're playing slower, you don't really need this to ramp up. You're probably not playing a thief that needs this anyway. So it's kind of in a rough spot. Glow Wings, decent support thing actually. You give a barrier if your ranger does a non-attack skill, but for most cases, rangers in PvE are probably using Song of Stars, which is a must-own artifact, or rangers in PvP are probably using Guiding Light to not get hit, stay in stealth. So Glow Wings, not that great. Iron Fan, also not that great. I used to use this on Biblis. It was great for turn cycling on her because she does AoEs pretty rapidly and she turn cycles herself naturally too. But other than that, it's not really useful. Just don't really bother, even though it already got a buff. Justice for All, not great. After your turn, you get a random buff that appears on you from a select few buffs that you can get. But again, why run this when you can run Elbrus Ritual Sword and just counter your opponents to death, right? Knowledge Seed, kind of like Holy Sacrifice, only good if you have it at plus 30. Even then, it's very niche. Most people will run it on like an Angel of Light Angelica, for example. It's a mage artifact, you hold it. If your unit dies, you have up to 100% chance, if you're plus 30, to grant a pretty strong buff to your team, like a greater attack buff, an evasion buff, a barrier, like all this stuff, right? That you can potentially get immunity, I think. But again, it requires your unit to die first, and you need it plus 30 to get that 100% chance to proc. Not the greatest thing. Manic of Control gives you extra crit rate, and I believe it actually gives you extra hit chance too. I don't really recall. They like kind of buffed this as well in the past, but it's okay, just it's not as good as other things. Like, why use Manic of Control when you can just forego a bit of damage in your build, like get 100% crit rate, right? And then just go for Alexa's Basket, get the attack buff, get the greater attack buff, and just slap your opponent really hard, right? Double-Edged Crescent, Shepherd of the Hollow, there's so many better options out there. Noble Oath, the lower your health goes, the more your defense and resistance increases. And no one really uses it, because why do that and keep that single knight alive when you can keep everybody alive with Aureus or Adamant Shield? Or if you really want to keep that knight alive, just use Holy Sacrifice. You'll come back, right? When you die and you come back with Holy Sacrifice, you lose all the debuffs and stuff that you'd have anyway. Whereas Noble Oath, the resistance that you get from this isn't really going to help you all too much. Alright, Pure White Trust, Zahak's artifact. Not good. Just don't bother. There's so many better warrior artifacts out there. Sphere of Inferno. So this is Bihu's artifact. Bihu's typically better on the event artifact down here, wherever it was. This one, Seal of Capture. Bihu's either use Seal of Capture for the extra burns, or Bihu's use Guiding Light to stay in stealth so you don't get hit. Spear of Inferno is just kind of subpar compared to those two options there. Next up, Sphere of Sadism. This is Yolha's artifact. Yolha runs Aureus. There's no reason to use this. It allows you to start the match with a barrier. That's pretty much about it. It starts, you can also, if you want to use Sphere of Sadism, it does increase your damage by a little bit. But in that case, just run Bastion of Perlucia. It gives you a barrier and immunity, and the unit in the backline a barrier and immunity. And usually your knights aren't doing damage anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Sword of Autumn Eclipse. Just don't. It's so bad. Gives attack. And I think it gives attack and hit chance or something to all your allies. It's not good. It's not good at all. Don't even bother with it. Sword of Winter Shadow. I'm putting this in don't. I know some people use it on Ron or their fast thief openers. The reason why I say don't is because you can steal souls from your opponent and stuff. Yeah, that's great. But to get the 100% chance to do so, it needs to be at plus 30, and it's just not worth it. It's just not worth it. Next up, Sword of Judgment. You get to do an extra basic attack, like an extra S1 attack if you use an S1. There's a chance to do it, at the very least. It's kind of like a worse version of RNL, but for Rangers. But again, why would you do that when you have Guiding Light? Right? This whole video has basically come down to why choose that when you have Sigurd, Golden Rose. Why would you choose that if you don't, when you can just choose Guiding Light? Why would you use that unless you have Book, right? Why would you do that if you have Elbrus? It's pretty much, these are the kings of the artifact world, and then everything else is just a subpar version. Twilight Calamity is a mage artifact. It's for Ida. I think it increases effectiveness, has chances to put extra debuffs on the opponent. Not really useful. No one really uses it. Umbral Keystones is Fumir's artifact. Pretty good for Fumir, but again, Fumir probably is running Book anyway, so not really good in that regard. Every 2 units that go on your turn, it can increase your combat readiness by 10 or 15%, I forget what it was, and this can only happen once every 3 turns or something. You can use it to get Fumir to take your extra turns sooner, but typically if you're using Fumir, you're playing an aggro cleave team anyway, so you're taking the first turn regardless, so this is not really useful overall. Wings of Light and Shadow, they're just better knight artifacts out there. This does increase your crit rate. It does increase the damage that's dealt with every subsequent crit that you do, as long as you continue critting. It's just, again, why would you use this if you have Elbrus, right? You can increase the damage that's dealt on your team, or you can luck sack your opponent on their own turn. And last but not least, Tyrant's Descent. This is Kane's artifact. Not really useful. No one even uses Kane himself after that rift, the first rift. So here are my final placements for all of the artifacts in this tier list. Hopefully this video has helped you guys out, and if it did, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on future Epic 7 content. And with that being said, until next time, take care.